Hello, Daniel.
Hello, Adam.
Um, well, for anyone who's listening, this is Daniel Polani. I'm Adam Safran, and we are going to talk about his work and specifically focus on a fascinating article he wrote on empowerment as a potential replacement or means of realizing by other means what are known as the laws of robotics, or means of having robots be governed in a way that would be compatible with human interests. That's one synopsis.
Thank you very much. You almost said everything. So the starting point of what we are interested in is the question: what drives agents in nature, and can we understand how agents in nature act? Of course, there are basic drives that are fundamental, like food and shelter and things like that. But we wanted to get a little bit away from that, and wanted to ask: is there something that is giving an organism a little bit more flexibility in making decisions? And there are a couple of studies that try to investigate that using so-called intrinsic motivations. These are not explicit rewards like food or drink or shelter or things like that, but they are actually implicit rewards that also are available when there is no clear external goal visible. And the advantage of having that means that even if you don't have a precise goal in front of you, you still can do it. Now, I will focus here on one specific intrinsic motivation, because that's the one we understand best. That's one we have been studying for the last decade and a half. And because it has some surprisingly natural properties, and that measure we called empowerment. Empowerment, in the word is chosen with care. It is actually chosen to reflect the idea of social and psychological sciences that empowerment means you are able to do things, you can change your environment, and you are aware that you can do it. So both aspects are important. You can change the environment, and the awareness of that is also available to you. It's not just some blind action in an otherwise unresponsive world. And the way we model that is using information theory. So what does empowerment do? Essentially, the sharp formulation of that is the channel capacity between what you do and what you can observe about your changes in the future. So you inject information to the world by changing it, you move stuff around, and you can see the move. If you can't see the move, it doesn't count. If you can see what happens in the world, but you cannot change it, it doesn't count. It only counts if you can change it and you can see it.
And by channel capacity, could you say a little more on that?
Yes, channel capacity is a term from information theory, which says how much information can I send through the channel at most? And it is measured in bits. So for example, if I can move, say, a coin onto heads or tails, and I'm free to choose in which state it will be, I have between two choices. This is called 1 bit. And if I can set that coin, and that coin will not be disturbed, and I can look at the coin and see what I've done without disturbance, then I have the full 1 bit empowerment. It's a very boring example, I know, but it's kind of the simplest thing you can do. You can look at a slightly more interesting case when you throw the coin on the floor and you are kind of more or less trained to throw it into heads or tails, but it's not always working. Then empowerment is not 1 bit anymore. You lose because you're not in full control of what happens. If you now don't have the glasses and you can't read the coin properly, you can't see exactly whether it's heads or tails, you lose further. So empowerment takes into account both how well you control what you're doing, as well how well you can pick it up.
I'm thinking of like the infant learning how to shake its rattle mightily and taking great joy in this, or so it seems from the outside. And yes. So that would be both noisy on the side of the sensation in terms of, or it would be the sensors would be, still coming online, but also the control, the ability to actually affect that change. It's not going to be a clean flip or a clean like shake at first.
Yes.
And so that would be like an example of like
And,
that.
and with time, you would learn to become better at this, right? You could control your shake. And if you look at infants at the beginning, they just open hands and close them. But with time, they start learning that they can actually move their fingers independently. And of course, when you go to musicians, that's what they train a whole lifetime to do, to move their fingers as independently as required by the instrument of their choice.
So not just the rattle, but really any kind of actuation will kind of have that structure in development of having this noise, this the relationship between the articulation and the outcome will like having a grip on something. Like at first, it'll be difficult to get a grip, and then like you learn how to get more and more sure grips on things.
Absolutely, precisely. Yeah, that's a very good description of the thing. And you become better at certain things, more and more reliable. At some point, you decide, okay, I don't care about being better at this anymore, and you start investing your efforts elsewhere. But the core idea is control over the world, or I will quote Tobias Jung, who phrased it so fantastically. He says, it is good, being in control of your own fate is good, but only if you know it. So it's being in control of your fate and knowing about it. That's what you're trying to maximize. And the argument for this is evolutionary. We mostly use an evolutionary argument. There are many other arguments too, but we mostly use an evolutionary argument, which basically say if you're an organism and you have an actuator sensor loop, and you have an actuator that actually doesn't affect the sensor at all, then why do you need this sensor? It doesn't matter to pick up anything from the environment on that degree of freedom, because you can't change it anyway, right? So my favorite example is fish that live in dark circumstances. So for example, fish that live in the caves. And these fish tend to be blind. They can't see anything. There's no light. There's no way of having light. So all they would do, they're just wasting energy in having these sensors. So they basically de-evolve seeing. They still have eyes, but they don't work. And they instead use their sight, the line or organ, to detect the world. There's another solution. Fish who live in deep seas, they evolve the opposite solution. Instead of becoming blind, they develop the way.
Bioluminescence.
Bioluminescence. So they create light. So the actuators were enhanced to fill the channel. In the cave fish, they found one corner of the evolutionary space, which is de-evolve the sensors. In the sea, where probably they had more options because it was bigger and there was a bigger selection of possible symbiotic solutions that they could use, they evolved the ability to create light and therefore activate the channel and use the eyes. And then the eyes are really big and quite capable. So this is kind of the general gist. If you think of it purely computationally and you forget about noise for a second, essentially what you can say is empowerment is a measure of how many states can you reach in the future in a given, say, horizon, for example. So how many states can I reach? It's mobility in games. Money is empowerment. It's something you can do. It doesn't mean you do it.
Optionality. Optionality.
Optionality. The opposite of helplessness, right? This was, learned helplessness was a big deal. Although there is now newer evidence that says that actually helplessness is the default state. Seems to indicate that helplessness might be the default state and empowerment needs to be learned, which is actually very nice because that's how I would expect things to work. You learn that you can do things. There are very, very basic things that you can do right away, but most of the things have to be learned.
And like, and connections between learned helplessness and depression, it would be like, yeah, I've lately been thinking a lot about depression as like, a lot of it's being heterogeneous, but like a good amount, or maybe heterogeneous on one level, but not so much on another, of just like difficulty imagining oneself as a cause. Like
Yes, exactly. So yes,
and then you don't see a means of realizing value, of working towards anything, and you know.
precisely. So this all is basically an antipode to helplessness.
And you would expect this if like this is a fundamental cybernetic function, like a fundamental drive. You would expect that tie to happiness to be there, that there would be this link between empowerment and flourishing or despair. Like you would expect us to be in tune to this.
Exactly. Sometimes the most important thing is actually empowerment difference, right? You want it to increase if you can, or you want to keep it high if you can. If there's no empowerment difference, it can also be a little bit problematic, because then essentially everything is the same, right? You get this video game, but essentially you can do it all and you can go everywhere, and then it gets boring. So discovery of new features, new possibilities, and it's not exactly curiosity. It's related with it, but it's not the same, and the relation is very subtle. But this is not something I wanted to talk about today. It's just I mentioned it, so it's linked with curiosity, but it's not the same thing. It is a little bit oblique to it in a certain way. And now that you talk about it, that
I hope we can get into that next time, because I hope we can get into that next time, because it'll probably take us a couple sessions.
Absolutely. No worries. Now, the interesting part about the whole thing is that you were talking about happiness and empowerment and happiness. And one reason we have this conversation today is about how can empowerment help us understand how to make robots more amenable to what we humans would like to have. The problem with the robot laws is people usually like to cite them, the sense of Asimov.
Three of them,
is that they are a little bit vague, and it's hard to operationalize them, and they might be misunderstood. And in fact, the whole point of Asimov is that they are actually being misunderstood by the robot.
And so the three laws: a robot shall obey a human, so it's or shall obey commands given to it.
Shall not harm humans.
Not harm. So does the order matter?
Hard to say. I'm not too much an Asimov expert that I would probably an Asimov hardcore fan might object to a different order.
Okay, so let's do the canonical order. So what's the canonical order?
I think the order is, I think, not harm, shall follow the command of the human, and shall protect itself. I think this was kind of basic ones. You can imagine other ones, but these are the basic principles. So the point is, it should not harm a human. The problem is with this, robots could say, put the human in a golden cage and we'll protect you. Nothing will come harm to you. That's certainly not what we want.
All sorts of perverse instantiations can happen through misunderstandings of like, or through either misunderstandings or some sort of like adversarial realization, like some sort of low complexity realization.
Yeah, either adversarial or simply because it's maybe adversarial is a good way to put it.
Or just confused.
Or
just confused.
Yeah, just confused, or simply what I call the you ask for it, you got it effect. When you do run genetic algorithms, then you put in value function or fitness function, and then you turned out that it optimizes it, but not in the way you want it.
So like genies.
Like who?
Genies.
Genies, yes.
They'll grant your wishes exactly as you ask them. It may not be what you want, but it will be what you asked for.
Yes, the letter and not the spirit. And this is also one problem with the communication via report functions. So the question is, what does empowerment have to offer here? So the first rule is don't harm humans. Very simple. Maximize the human's empowerment. So let's put it this way. The idea here is, and let's talk just about a single human to make it easy, right? To not complicate things. This makes it very easy not to harm humans in a, for example, lethal way. Death means zero empowerment. So that's the lowest value you can get. Definitely you want to keep the human away from death. And now, once you do that, you want to give them many options. So golden cage is out. You can't keep them in the cage. You have to give them everything they may want to do. Now, this opens other dilemmata, which I'm not going to go into today, which is, for example, the paradox of choice. Too many choices. What shall I do? Well, perhaps I'll go into that nevertheless, because it's relevant. If I put you in front of a huge keyboard with lots of options where you can do all this, you're totally overwhelmed. You don't have empowerment, you're just panicking. But the point is, now I educate you to use it. Think of it an organist with a big organ, or somebody who plays an instrument like a piano or some other big computer with lots of options. When I teach you how to use them, having more options is actually a good thing. So in other words, empowerment is not just about having the options in principle, but actually having a way to link what you're doing, what you're intending to do, to the outcome. So you have an internal model of how things will take place. And then the extra options are actually good. So I want effective options, not just
that you have to know it.
Yes, you have to know them. You have to know how to use them. You have to learn the model. So it's not enough to just here it is. Just
a lot of degrees of freedom in that case, but none of them are actually, but if you don't know what to do with them, they're not realizable, and you don't have, I guess, a free will. You don't have the way to have meaningful choice in that circumstance.
Yes,
they might as well not even be there because you don't know how to search through them and arbitrate amongst them.
Exactly. So it's not enough to just in principle put them in front of the agent. You actually, or the human, you actually have to empower the human in the sense, in the most, say, pedagogical sense. The human needs to be able to learn how to link what they do with outcomes, and this is part of the empowerment model, right? It hasn't been studied a lot yet, but it's part of the model, and it's already basically in the framework, and it can be dealt with predicting what's going to happen. So if I give you a very complex, balancing game, then when you're not experienced, your predictor model is basically noise. So you can't predict anything, therefore empowerment is very low.
You use the term Umvelt in the paper.
Okay.
And so, like, would you think of like the Umvelt as a kind of world model or predictor model that would help to link your actions with outcomes in a way that would help you to establish these empowerment relations? Or like this idea of, so the function of the Umvelt with relation to what you're saying. I'm wondering, we could get into that later, but.
The Umwelt is a little bit distinct in that what we look at is, the question is, different contexts create different types of empowerment, right? So you want to distinguish worlds by what options do they give you. If you sit on a bicycle, your Umwelt is different than if you walk, right? Your legs move kind of similar, but the way you have to control things and the way you get effective forward movement is different. And so the Umwelt is probably more what I would call context in this sense. Of course, it's always embodiment. The embodiment is always there and always determines what type of information flows, happens through the world.
So the Umwelt, if I'm remembering, so that's what school was describing, like an organism-centered world of experience.
Yes.
Structured. This was before Gibson, so we wouldn't have said affordances. We had something like a field of affordances structuring an organism-centered, and he wouldn't have this term either, but a life world of the organism centered on its embodiment. Okay. And it's
yes.
And within there, the Umwelt would define these sets, these contexts.
Yes. Okay. Now I understand what your question is. Yes, Umwelt is, in this sense, absolutely essential to any discussion about empowerment and any related quantities. Essentially, it sits there at the agent and forms what types of information flows can go through the world and what, in particular, the agent can send to the world and recapture. And this is a bit like a filter or sieve or some kind of imposing some structure, and this structure is essentially what the agent is exploiting.
And a bottleneck.
It is a bottleneck. It's more than a bottleneck, because a bottleneck is usually people think of bottleneck, for example, information bottleneck, and that's purely combinatorial. What I'm talking about here is a bottleneck that
Generative bottleneck. A generative bottleneck.
Yes, it imposes structure. It imposes structure. It puts constraints on how you can interact with the world. And
so it constrains, then you expand also.
Yes, but it's not just quantitative, it's qualitative. That's the important part. It's qualitative, not just quantitative. I think this is the important part, that it tells you which information matters. Not just it's fewer or more. It tells you this matters and this one does not. Of course, this is what the information bottleneck is supposed to do. This was one of the big steps that it offered.
And so in AI, this isn't, in a way, could you say this is like a solution to the frame of relevance problem?
Yes.
And maybe not something necessarily to get into today, but maybe in biology, this was part of the adaptive significance of the evolution of phenomenal consciousness. Maybe.
There could be a possibility. I mean, let's put it this way.
The architecture that gave rise to it.
Hmm?
Or the architecture.
What's not clear is whether consciousness evolved for a reason or as a side effect, and when that was then used. This is very common in biology, where you have these creeping repurposing of functionality. It's called acceptation, if you want a technical term. And this creeping change of functionality is absolutely crucial, in my opinion, to understand why biology is so incredibly successful. So you sit on a certain point, and there is, in many cases, the ability to move into a new solution that does certain things better than others, without actually having to undo what you evolved. Because you have to undo an evolution, that's very hard. It's almost impossible. Usually that's a dead end and then you die. But if you can avoid that, you can repurpose what you have, then you might survive. That's not just true for evolution in biology, it's true for evolution of companies, of countries. It is a general principle. You can't easily reverse evolve. You can discard, but you cannot reverse evolve.
So a lot of these principles, unclear, like a lot of these could have been handled before, like kind of looping to, from the beginning, I'm maybe having us jump over some steps. We can go back more carefully, but a lot of these principles would apply necessarily even before you had an architecture capable of supporting anything that elaborate. It's just these, like, are there these information channels, these connections between actuators and sensors? And now and there's still an Umvelt, even if they don't come together in some sort of integrated fashion through some sort of architecture that could give rise to actually a world of experience. These principles still apply. Empowerment's can apply to any cybernetic system. Yes. That's a complex adaptive agent in its world.
You can apply it at any level, right? One of the reasons why we followed this model was that you can do it as a bacterium, you can do it even as a simple evolutionary protein that has some evolutionary advantage by doing certain things. You can do it on a simple animal level, limbic system. As far as you go, it keeps working. It's not exactly clear how these levels can interact and how we can make them work. This is something that's current research, but the principle is very simple and it's universal.
And potentially useful in AI and robotics before we've done things like solve common sense problems.
Absolutely. You don't need to understand what you're doing to do more or less plausible things.
Which is part of the problem with the laws of robotics, is like they're assuming this complex understanding and this common sense, which might not be there, and might place you in these genie situations with these undesirable instantiations. And so this is going to be useful the whole way through over the course of evolution, and it's useful today, and the whole way through, even before we've solved some of the enduring problems of AI.
Exactly. It's protoverbal. You don't need words. You don't even need concepts, strictly spoken. And
so we're getting past a lot of cart horse problems here. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So this is one of the reasons why empowerment is a good candidate. Very, very good other candidate.
There was a glitch in the matrix. So you said good candidate, and then
yeah, it's a good candidate. Probably the system just censored my plug for other measures. But I'm not saying this is the only possible measure. What I'm saying is that this measure has many desirable properties and may teach us what is required to make something like that work. And I mentioned the law number one, and probably I should also mention 2 and 3, how you would implement. And let's do 3 first. 3 that is also quite easy. 3 means protect yourself as a robot, maximize your empowerment. So if empowerment goes to 0, the robot is broken. So the robot will protect itself if it maximizes its empowerment as a secondary optimization, right? Never primary to the human. So it will never trade off human empowerment for its own sake. There are exceptions. You can design exceptions. This is a long story, but let's not talk about that right now, because number 2 is the most, say, intricate one.
But so for 3, like I guess maybe like a Stuart Russell's, like you can't fetch the coffee if you're dead, or something.
Exactly.
And that could be any set of things that you want, that the robot wants to empower humans with. But some more complicated is there might be situations though where maximal human empowerment does involve the self-destruction of the robot, if there's like maybe no moves available for empowerment, or its continued existence is of a kind that would so we're using the term optionality before. Could we use the term freedom also?
I use it with a tongue-in-cheek. Okay, so we actually in our papers we actually write free will actions or something like that in quotes. So I do not want to enter the philosophical level of this.
Well, you were just saying like paradox of choice. So yeah, freedom could be inadequate in that way. It actually has to be meaningfully constrained freedom that would be related to things that could have controllability, and controllability that you know.
Yes. Yes. And the freedom is always a mathematical freedom, in the sense that we can create all the parallel worlds in which all these possible actions could have been taken. So this is a purely mathematical construction. It's not in any way real. It's a model. It's a model of what could happen. Like I can imagine I can fly through the air. Now people could imagine that, and that's why they imagined Superman. And this is just an imagination that we can do because we can symbolically mix and match concepts. We can imagine humans, we can imagine birds, we can imagine human flies like a bird. That's something that we can do. But if you look at, for example, wingsuits, well, we found a way to actually make that happen. But there's no reason to assume that this is possible. So there are people who believe we can move faster than light in science fiction. Maybe that's not ever possible. I'm not saying people try to do that, right? It's fine, it's good. But this is not a model, doesn't fit in the model that we believe works at this stage, right? While I can have a model of, oh, I could fly, as long as I don't have a model that I believe works, before we have flying machines and so on, it's not really part of the realistic alternatives. In the moment I have them, I have a model, okay, I can make humans fly in various ways. It becomes part of the model of realistic alternatives. And so it's always in the way, if you think of these possible virtual possibilities, always in terms of a model. It's nothing magic, it's nothing metaphysical. It's completely, it's just a model.
But this model, so you're imagining these possibilities that of different kinds of value, you could realize different kinds of action. And if you didn't entertain flight, even though you can't fly at the moment, you would never have discovered the solution. But still, though, if you keep imagining it and there is nothing that approximates it, nothing that makes it look like that's a realizable path, that might be one that you sample from or imagine you engage in or not. But like, so there, it's eventually you might stop imagining something where there is nothing that relates to it. But around something, or around like a realizable path, you might kind of be exploring different possibilities that don't seem realizable at the moment, but potentially could be.
Yes. And humans are particularly notorious for that, of course, because, I mean, Cyrano de Bergerac imagined a flight to the moon, in fact, with the help of a box with some rockets attached to it. So, technically he was not right, but he was actually quite close to the principle. And so this is something very weird. The reason why this works is not clear. I always say the first human was the ape that pointed to the moon and said, I want to go there. It's always my joke that when you abstract away from the things that you can do immediately. But empowerment is about the things that you can do immediately, or at least with reasonable chance.
Which is why it works the whole way through over the course of evolution and development. Like before you have sophisticated abilities, it still is a powerful objective.
Exactly. So if you're not very good at shooting arrows, then you shoot an arrow at a large distance. The chances are that you hit the targets very low, but there is a certain chance, and you can enhance the chance as you become better and better. But here you at least have a path of getting there. When you don't have the path at all, then I wouldn't call it empowerment. It's not part of empowerment formalism to have the idea that I could possibly fly. The model has to be realistic.
I could see errors in terms of humans, or different types of errors resulting in different types of success and failure modes. Like,
of course,
yeah, the inability to imagine a broad enough set, you might get stuck and then in a depressed state, or you could potentially go into like a manic or a psychotic state if you don't have a pruning of these possibilities.
Yes. Yeah, and in manic states you believe that your model reaches further, and therefore you think you can do more, which may be true actually in some cases, and in depressed states probably your horizon shrinks and you think you can do less.
It's true as a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like,
yes, partly.
If you think you can't, you can't.
If you can, you can't, but even that is not always.
If you think you can't and then you don't try.
Yeah, that's the point. That's why I'm saying actions are important. Actions are the key, and there's a good reason why they say that. I think this was Theodore Roosevelt who says the best decision is the right decision, the second best is the wrong decision, and the no decision is the worst decision. And this is partly true, right? If you postpone the decision intentionally because you want to gather more information, that's a different story. That's a decision too. But essentially, not deciding because you cannot decide, that's bad, because the decision will be taken from you then.
It'll both be taken from you, so it's not going to be optimized in the direction, or it might be, but you have no influence to channel the dynamics in the way that you want, and also you might have less learnability. And that
exactly.
So that's what, yeah. So the bad decision or the wrong decision, at least you're learning.
Yes, you're learning, and you can also say, I did the best under the circumstances, or I didn't have better time to make a better decision. Plus, I think also you
Something of like generalized motor babbling.
It's there is a phenomenon we see in empowerment, and model may be happening in other models too, is that you actually span the space of outcomes. So when you have a random walk, you can be all over the place. But when you use empowerment, usually empowerment selects salient spots, good or bad, but they are salient. They are decisive. They have character, if you like. And this means that you have, as you say, better learnability, because you can say this is a clearly bad spot. This is a clearly good spot. But also the outcomes are better defined. So unless you want intentionally to keep the outcome ill-defined, which then it's a decision. So you say, okay, information leakage is also part of my equation, which sometimes you may want to, for example, in cases of war, in war situations, you want to be unclear. You want to be unpredictable.
Best way to be unpredictable. So you don't want others to predict you, to plan against you. And a good way of being unpredictable is being unpredictable even to yourself.
Exactly. And that may be a decision, that's fine, as long as it's clear. This is what you do. This is a salient spot in the strategy space. What's not good is when you're sitting somewhere in an indistinct spot of the space, because these spots are it's not clear what to do there. It's not clear where you're coming from. It's not clear how to, as you very aptly stated, how to bundle strategies in these spots. Basically, these clear spots, the salient spots, are spots where strategies can be bundled, and therefore you have control over them, or better control over them than you would have in somewhere in the middle of nowhere. That is kind of my intuition about why it's good to decide.
You're not in that paradox of choice situation when you have these bundlings.
Yes, or you reduce it.
It's controllable, it's modelable.
Yes.
For a limited capacity system, modeling system can actually find these dimensions, these handles of influence.
Yes, exactly. These are spots where you are in charge, or it's easier for you to be in charge. And you will see that you can see that in chess games when people play, then there are these balanced spots and very unbalanced ones where it's very, very hard to control. Only the best players can manage them. There are these spots which is balanced situation where even they speak of a balanced situation. What does it mean balance? It just means that this is handleable. We know what's going on. We know where we are. We have an orientation.
There's like a set of motifs around it of like likely moves, and so
yeah, we understand what to do. It's not like, okay, what now?
Interesting. We use the term handleable, isn't it?
Yeah.
Grip.
Exactly. You have good grip over the situation. And this is actually law number 2, if I have the order right in place. That is, obey the orders. And obey the orders in a non-verbal setup is interesting, and with empowerment is actually quite easy to do. Simply maximize empowerment across agents, from human, for example, to the robot, what the robot does. So whatever the human does has an effect on what the robot does. Yeah, I'm simplifying drastically. I mean, you would have to read the full paper to see exactly how it works, but essentially the idea is that, for example, it could imply signing or gesturing, that the robot will follow your gesture and actually react to it in a predictable way, and in a different way to a different gesture, right? It will not be far away from you, so you can see it. And it will be actually reacting to you and not just do its own stuff. So what is an order? Doesn't have to be verbal. When you talk to a dog, I mean, some orders may be verbal.
You need an open channel that you can read.
It needs to be an open channel, and the channel needs to be effective. So it needs to be predictable. If the robot is very chaotic, a loose cannon, if you like, that's not helping you.
You
Yeah,
need
you
a
don't.
line of sight, sound, or touch. It doesn't have to be any particular one, but you need to be able to exchange those bits.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, the decision on which ones it is not made in information theory. It's not part of information theory, because information theory is completely combinatorial, right? One code is as good as the other as long as the coding complexity is the same. That's actually a very interesting point, because the Umvelt embodiment, that actually changes this. It makes certain codes more suitable than others. It imposes constraints on what combinatorics is preferable. And favorite examples, of course, bridge, the game of bridge, where you actually bid. It's a way to communicate what you have in your cards, but this is not entirely free to choose this code, because it has consequences for how the game will be played, and what the trump cards are going to be used, and what will basically how far you're going to make your bid. So in other words, you pay a price, you pay an embodied price for communicating. That is what changes in an embodied world. Signaling does not come, it is not completely equivalent. The landscape is not flat.
So Shannon intentionally, like, I guess, was it in the context of telecommunications, like making it like agnostic? It doesn't matter what's being exchanged over those telephone lines. It's just treat them all the same, and then we can think of what's the capacity of this network. Doesn't matter what kind of conversation you're having, and later wouldn't matter if it's I'm sending you, pictures of cats or Netflix videos. Just it's a doesn't matter. But once we've structured this in an embodied world,
Yes.
now it does. Not all bits are created equal anymore. It's
exactly. Now the bits are distinguished, and in my opinion, that was one of the big insights, the major insights of the information bottleneck by Tishby, where he said, okay, there is this information and some of it is relevant. Very simple idea in principle, but super insightful. You suddenly see, okay, that not all bits are created equal. And I do think that once you have embodiment, you get multiple variants of what's relevant. It depends on what you're doing, depends on the goal, depends on what you're retaining, depends on what information processing capacities you have, etc. There's so many constraints that start to appear that they impose a natural structure of information flow on what we are doing. In my opinion, that is what determines how cognition works. And if we want to understand cognition, we have to look, of course, people do that across species. So people compare octopus brains and mammalian brains, fish brains, etc., to understand what's common, what's not. I like the octopus a lot because it's probably the nearest we come to a high performing, high intellect animal in a non-mammalian, non-vertebrate line of descent. And of course, it looks very different in some aspects, but I think there are some repetitive principles. So it's very clear that something is universal, and I do believe that information is the language to talk about this universality.
And with respect to these drives, so you should expect an agent that's trying to maximize the information being exchanged between you and its sensors, its impact on you.
Mm-hmm.
It'll have very different behaviors depending on what channels allow that to happen, which will depend on its specific embodiments, its specific effectors and sensors. And so a line of sight versus hearing versus
Yes.
touch would give you very different patterns of like trying to maintain proximity or not. Because like I could like, there could be like a tension. Like I'm thinking of like like even in this conversation, like, like I want to listen to you and hear you, but I could like not give you enough conversational space and limit your empowerment.
Absolutely.
That's because of like the channel in my attempt. And so it's different. It's going to be different based on like how the information could come through.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just in amounts, but also in character, right? So if it's well known that you can talk about sensory modalities. And the visual sense and the auditory sense are very different modalities. And so the interesting thing about, for example, bats is that they turned an auditory modality into a visual modality. The sensory motor contingency that they are using behaves essentially like a visual modality. And we know
you have a spatial field.
You have a spatial field, yes. You have a spatial field and it behaves spatially.
There's locality and there's things relative to things within this space.
Yeah, and possibly in the sense that we talked about earlier, for example, with Julio's location model. And you have completely other type of such embodiments, completely different ones. Touch, for example, is a classic one. You will notice that, for example, when you sit down on a chair, very rarely you watch very closely where you sit. Most of the time, there's a chair there, I sit down and it's good. And it's very interesting because it means that the visual sense, so once you know how to sit, the visual sense essentially plays an under a role, a low priority role. The touch sense is much more important. When the chair is not where you expect it to be, it's either too high or it's too low, and you feel, oh, I'm basically discomforted. Or stairs is another good example. It's very interesting to see that when you walk the stairs, our visual sense sees them, right? We have a optical flow that sees where the stairs are actually shifting, and if that's not very clear where the stairs are, in fact, going down, then it's a problem that building codes have this rule that you have this clear stripe so that the human can pick that information up. But ultimately, you take the step down and you have an expectation how deep the step is. And usually that is relatively standardized. You don't get big surprise. You may get big surprise when you go to an old castle, when the stairs are very flat, for example, for kings who can't walk anymore because they have eaten too much, or in old houses where there were no building codes and you essentially, they were actually death traps.
Kings with gout or old creaky stairs that might break on you and then you, and so, but when you're putting like those like markers on this stair, you're calling attention to you. So I guess like with like if you have like a predictive processing like hierarchy, or like multiple intersecting hierarchies of each sense being its own modeling system, you put in unexpected information to up the gain on that channel.
Yes.
Because exactly. Otherwise you might handle it. You might handle it with like a set of like minimally I don't know, modeled like fast feedback loops or something like this to like,
yes,
like handing it off to like some sort of like, and like the brain would be like the cerebellar system orchestrating like very close to the modality fast feedback loops, and the cerebral system like learning how to do this to like free up capacity for integrated processing for the novel, for the unexpected, for those creaky stairs, for okay.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I like to call these implicit background information processing metabolic information processing. So what goes on all the time? Basically, you just run it to keep the integrity of the system in a way. Probably the stairs is not a good example because you don't always walk stairs, right? You sometimes do other things. But yes, and there can be very small hints that can make your life so much easier, right? We don't need many hints if they're well placed. The classic examples, of course, these dot pictures where you have put light dots on humans and they make a movement, and you ask, what is that? Is that man or a woman? What are they doing? And people usually can say, just for a couple of 10 dots or 12 dots, they can recognize what the person is doing. Stick figures. We are unbelievably good at picking up the features if they're well chosen.
Does this imply that if we want, so this is probably these laws of robotics, but rather these laws of empowerment, they're probably they also can be used as like a model for socio-emotional intellectual development in humans, and like to a non-trivial degree.
Yeah.
Do you think in order for like as AI becomes more advanced, if it is leveraging this sort of the setup of some constellation of empowerment drives, or would this imply that you might, even though it's difficult, giving it a human-like embodiment with similar affordances and constraints could have a certain value for ensuring, for helping to shape proper mutually empowering behavior? Like if it's too alien in its embodiment, might there not be a learning curriculum set up where it learns to empower in the way that is the one you would want? So like ultimately, so
It's not necessarily the case. I mean, there's no reason to assume that you have to choose a similar embodiment. I mean, dogs clearly have a different embodiment. Okay, they still have legs and so on. But I'll give you an example. Imagine we start traveling through space and we decide that it makes sense to have intelligent spaceship for some reasons, right? Multi-generation travel. The spaceship has a lifetime of 10,000 years. So that there's one entity that actually survives for a longer time than the individuals on the ship. And there's no reason to assume that this entity needs to have the same embodiment. It's a ship, and it knows it carries humans, and they have a symbiotic relationship, hopefully. And at the end of the day, the ship might have, their way of interacting with the humans. It could be benevolent, like think of it as a whale, like these whales that help save humans from sharks. There were these cases where, I mean, the embodiment is very different, the world of thinking may be different, but they still somehow felt that they should protect the humans from sharks. Now, why would they do that? Not clear, but clearly they felt a kinship. Yeah, and humans clearly have behaved much worse to whales than whales have behaved to humans, right? If you don't read Moby Dick as an exception. And that's literature. Okay, there was perhaps a real case, but
you're having a species there that's fairly different in its the way it's actuating and sensing. You have so like dogs, it's different. So that's showing that it doesn't have to be necessarily like a humanoid embodiment. You're getting a very good symbiosis going there, that's flexible and rich. But in the whale case, you're pushing it even more, because now you're in somewhat of an echolocation regime again, and they're swimming. They're not even sharing the same space in the same way as you, yet you're still getting this kind of other concern, where the form of other concern and care is empowerment.
Yeah, in a way it is. And so I don't think that embodiment is critical to make sure that they can work together. The critical part is to make sure that the sanctioning regime is appropriate. So you cannot prevent people from doing bad things. The way to prevent them from doing bad things is a kind of social agreement. You essentially create a situation where many individuals decide that certain behaviors are acceptable. If they are violated, or not acceptable, if this is violated, then there are sanctions. And the sanctions can be, like in say Western world, it's incarceration, which is a depriving of empowerment. If you notice, that's what it is. It's nothing else, right? It's not beating. It's not infliction of pain. It's a depriving.
Radically curtailed options. Radically curtailed options.
Radically curtailed their options, right? And to me, that is an indication that this is exactly what we're doing. We sanction behavior we don't like. And of course, if the society thinks that certain behavior is acceptable, which are different from what we think in the Western world, and you let that develop, these people will use those behaviors, right? I'm not speaking in favor of cultural relativism or moral relativism. I'm just saying that socialization matters. So if you want the AI to behave in an acceptable way, it needs to be socialized in that way. And then you still have no 100% guarantee, but you don't have that with humans either. So what you do to prevent it from humans becoming too nasty is simply limitation of total control, concentration of power. And it took us some time to discover this as a principle. It was rediscovered several times. I mean, the Roman Republic had 2 consuls, not 1, probably for that reason. The Spartan kings were double kings, probably for the same reason. And all modern institutions have that. Distribution of power. You want to avoid having a single agent too much power. And to be honest, every time that breaks down, you are essentially on a playing roulette. Because if you're lucky and you have a capable leader who's not, who has it himself under control, you may be getting out of that well. But you really don't want that as a regular situation.
We don't have to get into this now necessarily, because I want to, I've interrupted you too much already from like this paper, but eventually I would like to hear your thoughts on what's occurring to me is like, so that kind of situation you described, or maybe even earlier, I don't know when it started, that like we had these cases of unchecked power, and then we decided that the word power was dirty and everything related to it was. Yet at the same time, this is the fundamentals of a cybernetic system of what it needs to do. And so the knock-on effects of taking like the great belief web and just making taboo some of the maybe the most central node. The knock-on effects for both psychology, for our understanding of societies, of individuals, it has to be immense. Like to make taboo the most fundamental, to be able to talk about it in a way, like we can't talk about it, and we talk about it all the time. In some ways, it's all we talk about, yet we don't. Like it's like we have to do these circumlocutions all the time, just to like avoid like too much. Maybe it's because it's like so important that we get anxiety about it, and then we find ourselves avoiding it. Like anyway, so later, I'd be very interested in like if you like, maybe I'm misconstruing this, but like what you think the knock-on effects to hear you. Yeah.
It's a very good question. I think the problem is taboos. People treat taboos either absolutely necessary or absolutely bad. As always, the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? Taboos have a role. There's a good reason we have taboos. Having taboos is probably what permits us to scale our society up to levels where we go far beyond interacting with people we know personally, right? So taboos are very useful. The problem with taboos is, I'm actually borrowing an idea from Heinrich Heine's Romancero, where basically taboos are a bit like, how to say, when you put them out of a job, they look for another job, right? So you remove a taboo, it's not going to go away. It just latches on something else. And so the point is, when you look at power and people say taboo, it's taboo, we have to ask, why is it taboo? And it's taboo because power has this, people look at it through the eyes of, there's a king, or there's an autocrat, or a dictator, or a very powerful person, and it imposes his will on others. Well, of course, that's not a very nice situation. And
the way you're describing it, it's basically love. And the way you're describing empowerment in this article, it's in some ways it's an operationalization of love.
Or compassion, empathy, compassion. I think Schopenhauer at this point, I'm not always agreeing, it's very pessimistic, but he's right that compassion is important, because even if you decide you're an antagonist of somebody, compassion means that you understand why they're doing things. It's also in your favor of understanding that, because not always are they your enemy, or should be your enemy. It can be, but it's not always the case. And people like to hone in of, oh, this is what it is. They like to simplify very fast. decisions, remember, usually that's a good thing. Unfortunately, with things like that, with things as complex as humans, it shouldn't be done. Now, if you look at power, the problem with power is when it's too centralized. What you want is to make judicious use of power. Give the right power to the right people at the right time. We don't know how to do that, right? There's no theory of how to do that properly. But think of it like, you have a ship. And of course, you can't have any sailor just shouting commands. I mean, the ship will not go anywhere, right? So you need somebody who makes the decisions, like the captain. But everybody has a role, right? And then the first officer said to the captain, look, I don't think this idea is good. We have to move there. We have to do this. And then the captain has to consider that. So it's a flow of information in both directions. And of course, there's more centralized and more distributed part of the power. And in a society, for example, we don't want some autocrat giving people orders. We don't want, some dictator telling us, no, you can't now have this interview today. You have to do this. You have to, do the daily worship of the whatever the great how I say the great obelisk in the center of my courtyard. You don't want that. What you want is to find a good balance of empowerment so that this is maintained for as long as possible, ideally for everybody, as much as possible. I mean, this is an old idea. And of course, how do you choose the weightings is still a question to decide, and we can't, there's not scientific solution to that. But essentially what makes politics so complicated is that people claim there is the only way of doing this particular weighting. And that's not always clear. Keeping your mind open about the fact that the weighting may not be easy to predict, right? It may be that the right thing to do right now is to stop using oil immediately. That's as an example. Or the right thing to do from a long-term perspective is to just use nuclear energy because there's no other way to save the planet. We don't do it because what we don't know, right? We don't know that. But say an alien comes to us and says, look, this is what happens. I know you don't like nuclear energy, but you have to use it right now, from today. Okay, so they have seen the future, have computed it, and have a solution. But we don't have this insight. There's always a cloud of uncertainty about our future. And this is what makes it important to ask, can we compute empowerment for multi-agent system that tells us what's the best we can do under the knowledge we have now? The hard part is getting rid of our atavistic, prior desires. So if you think of, for instance, free energy, right? Active inference. Oh, this is what I have in mind. This is what should happen. We have to get rid of this. But of course, this is a good way, perhaps, to control agents, but it's not a good way to create a future. Because if you just want to create your prejudice is what you're going to get until the world wakes you up and tells you. I have too many citations today, and I apologize for this. Philip K. Dick said, reality is what does not go away when you stop believing in it. So if you do things that are counter to what ensures your survival, you borrow time. You can live on this borrowed time for a while, but you take a credit. At some point, you will have to pay it back.
So it's partially like, so some of the taboo could be related to when you get these unbalanced power structures, which, as technology advanced, the outcomes were increasingly fearsome, and here we are today. It's still an ongoing problem. And so that's some of it, but it seems also from what you're saying that like the complexities of the different types of the trade-offs involved, of the different modes of realization, means that in some ways the appropriate stance with respect to power and empowerment and thinking about it is a caution and ambivalence, and that you can very easily get it wrong in terms of having things too concentrated, not concentrated enough.
Yes.
And it can enter in different. So that's like in this I guess the height of complexity would be this multi-agent context. But even, and I guess also within that multi-agent context, we haven't even gotten to like the potential like rival dynamics, like, and like, so someone like you might, for instance, being less legible or predictable yourself, like, so that could be, so some of the advantage, so there could be an advantage of people being, so ultimately there's a sense in which everyone must necessarily want empowerment as this like universal instrumental good. Like if you want something, you want to have the ability to control things enough to, take this like sea of becoming and channel it in that direction meaningfully. Like,
Yes.
otherwise, did you want the thing to begin with? So like we're either nihilists or we value empowerment. But your specific like ways in which you realize it, there's all sorts of trade-offs involved that require care, but also you potentially make yourself vulnerable to attack, or you might utilize it if you're too clear in your motives. How do I think?
If you're clear in the motives, you
so
someone
could plan against you.
Of course.
So is that so? Yeah.
This is a classic problem in say multi-agent scenarios, because clarity is something you often want. If you drive on a road, you expect everybody to adhere by the rule that you drive on one side and the other direction drives on the other side. And here you want actually to be transparent. On the road, you want to be transparent. In war, you want to be intransparent. In real life, in business, it's a mixture. It's a very interesting mixture, because you want to do business, say you want to buy something, but you don't want them to know that how much you're ready to pay for it, for example. So it's really, really unclear, right? The other thing to keep in mind, and I think we should be wary of that. I mean, empowerment is not answering every question, right? Empowerment is a proxy for a situation where the goal is far away, or where potential goals are far away. When you know what your goal is, here's your sandwich in front of you, you're hungry. Well, I mean, it's not about empowerment. Of course, it's about empowerment, putting sugar in your body and so on. But in the end of the day, the decision is, oh, there's a sandwich. I know how to grab it. I grab it and I eat it. So not really say empowerment is not the right model here. Another example that I actually like a lot, because it shows you how complicated the thinking is. If I have a football team that plays football and soccer in the US, so, and you play against another team, and think of the team as an agent, as a single agent. You control the ball. You want to control the ball. You control the ball. You decide where it goes, right? So if you look Pep Guardiola's Manchester City, they want to maximize empowerment, control of the ball. Come in front of the goal of the opponent. Well, what do you do with the ball? You let it go, because it should go into the goal. So you exchange empowerment for something that is of value. You turn it into the actual value.
You have no options with respect to that ball once it has left your foot, and
Yes.
it is flying away from you.
And it goes into the goal.
Influence is gone at that point, unless you have telekinesis, and you don't.
You give up the ball, but you give it up for something that you want. It's like money. Empowerment is like money. You, at the end of the day, you want to buy something with it. It's not just there to be there. Sometimes it is.
Trading it off for this extrinsic value.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something we haven't fully understood yet. This exchange. Of course, you could say, right, if I put the ball in the goal, I increase my empowerment in surviving the game to the next round. So you go outside of the game, you go to the meta game, and if I win the competition, for example, I get more money for my team, and then I can have a bigger team, a better team, and it can survive more competitions. And so you can always still argue with empowerment. Some people do that, but I want to say that sometimes it's actually more practical to just think, here I have empowerment, and I exchange it for something of concrete extrinsic value that I want. And I do that usually when I know how to do that. So empowerment, while I'm not entirely sure how I'm getting there, when I know how to do things, I do that.
It seems like it could be even like yeah, if you're just pursuing like pure optionality and you never exchange it for the realization of any sort of value in the world, I guess you could say like, well, in order to maintain your optionality, you need to have grips on the world. And you're not going to have grips on the world unless you do an exchange. And I guess you could fold in like,
Yeah.
But people would in general, though, consider that to be pathological, though. Like if you never, if you were only like, if you weren't, so I guess it's not like, even if there is potentially a significant genealogical reduction to empowerment as like a drive that's bringing forth things and ultimately things are feeding back into it, if it's not generative in this way, well, it wouldn't work on its own. It would fail on its own terms unless it gave the agent grips on the world.
Yes.
And gave it like an embedding in the world that was empowerment would end up being self-undermining, and we just and meaningless if it didn't.
I mean, in the end of the day, these extrinsic values are like choke points, right? Eating a sandwich is a very concentrated way of getting energy, right? Mm-hmm. You could imagine that you're living in a kind of matrix-like world where you get constantly drip-fed food, nutritious liquids into your body, and there would be never this concentrated time point where you actually eat, and then that's fine. Then you maximize your empowerment otherwise. So maybe we need to be careful about the emergence of these choke points is actually property of the world, right? If you get rid of them, then maximizing empowerment is perfectly fine, right? So you could say if you're a company, essentially most of the time, that's what you do. You try to maximize your market share, money, what you can do in the market, how you can push out opponents, that nobody can push you out, by the way. That's one part of empowerment, right? Especially if in a company, you want to make sure that you can operate and others cannot prevent you from doing so, right?
You're publicly traded, you have a legal duty to do that because ultimately it's shareholder value. It's
exactly, right? Even if it's a private company, the principle is always the same. So there's not this clear exchange of value, which happens very rarely if you do a takeover or something like that. But mostly it's a process that's kind of ongoing. So we don't understand the relation of these things very well yet. I personally think it is a kind of choke point in trajectories. So when you have these choke points, then you trade in empowerment for something else. And you say, I trade in my, I don't know, for example, when you're a politician and you decide there's a very important bill you want to absolutely make go through, you trade in your political credit, which is a form of empowerment, for having this bill actually accepted. And then you actually trade in empowerment for something else, which not even you may be actually reaping the benefits of, right? So your agenthood is not you, but actually whoever you hope to represent or you hope to act in favor for, right? So the other big question, but again, this is a separate big block of discussions, is who am I in empowerment? In empowerment, we talk about the agent and we just pretended like it's clear who the agent is. But right now I showed you that it's not clear at all. Who is me? Yeah, captain of a ship, is that a single person? Is that a representative of the ship, a representative of the Navy? And that is a very deep and very interesting question. But that is not something we can probably discuss today. But when you talk about empowerment, you assume that question is being already resolved.
I'm looking forward to when we get into that, and also the comment you made about relationships, like the way you're thinking about curiosity in relationship to empowerment later, that too. But so in this, so like I come into this more as like a psychologist and systems neuroscientist, and so like I'm thinking of what you're describing in this article on empowerment as a substitute or means of realizing the laws of robotics. Like I keep thinking of it as a model like socio-emotional development. But if the way, like from the beginning, the way you're like bootstrapping a mind, and so like in this article you're describing, like this is operating at this level of evaluating on these limited time horizons, just based on this relationship of the information channel between effectors of sensors of you for yourself, your own self-empowerment, or for you to someone else, or someone else to you, or the other person to them. And but the way in which these are being realized is through just those couplings. And so this is happening before you've even bootstrapped a complex world model. In fact, this is part of the bootstrapping process, helping to make sure that your world model is going to be fit for purpose to actually realize value. And it's basically a solution, it seems, to the frame problem in AI, or the relevance problem of like, how do you bootstrap a world? And it's so you're so this, if your model of self and world is intersubjective and interdependent in this way from the beginning, this question like, who am I? My interests are tied up with yours in this like way right from the beginning. Like it's a we that's difficult. That's one sense in which but that's what's coming to mind.
That is a very interesting question, and it's the more I think about it, the more confusing it becomes, to be honest. So I don't have a clear answer at this stage. I do actually think that even single personality can have multiple contradictory agendas, and the interesting question: when do they fall apart, and when do they play ball? When do they walk together? And what are the forces, and how to model the forces that keep them going together? I think this can be modeled. We have parts of this in game theory, but I think game theory is not giving us the mechanisms. And I do think that work needs to be done there to understand what are the cognitive mechanisms that can give us an understanding of when do entities operate as a whole, when do they split up.
Even within a single agent like context, I'm thinking of an analogy to the example you just gave for like shifting to nuclear power. Like if you don't know for certain what to do, like if you don't have complete knowledge of the consequences of your actions, committing too much could itself be maladaptive and disempowering ultimately.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the reason why probability theory works, right? I mean, you keep all the options there and play them through if you can. And what we do when Tversky and Kahneman talk about the two systems, my interpretation of that is a very good coarse interpretation, is that the deliberative system is trying to work with us most complete information, while the fast system, that one is the one that tries to simplify things, right? It takes a decision and creates an action. And this is okay for things that we either know well, so we have done them a lot, or things where fast action is unavoidable. The problem is a certain laziness of turning on system 2, the slow one. And I do think that that's exactly how system 1 and 2, I do think actually might be possible to model these cleanly as say system 1 is a kind of quick and dirty version of system 2 in a relatively principled way. I don't think this difficult to model, but I still have to bring the proof. So
I'm wondering. So that's interesting because like I actually can. So there's been some debates like in AI about like the use of the system 1, system 2 language, with like Bengio talking about like system 2 cognition, and then and analogizing this to something like what a workspace architecture might do, or like a bottleneck. And so that would make system 2, if that's the case, limited capacity, but the system 1, this like effortlessness and this like direct mapping does seem to be like lower complexity. And so I guess that would be like I was mentioning like the brains earlier, like this like this like mass, these fast feedback loops, this ecosystem of habits realized by like softly assembled habits that just realize effective coupling with the world, and have some sort of implicit world model in them. But this like it seems like these choke points would be more related to system 2.
The choke points permit you,
or I might be mixing levels of analysis here.
I think the choke points are a property of the environment, number one. Okay, they're not a property of cognition. I think cognition makes use of them because they are in the environment.
I am mixing.
I think they give you the option to decouple past and future. So what a choke point does is, at a choke point, you can forget the past.
So it's the definition of a cause almost.
Like
conditional dependence between past and future causation as like establishing mark.
Yeah, not necessarily. I mean, it's all it does. It says, okay, from this point on, forget what your trajectory looked now. The future doesn't depend on your past trajectory. And that is the key, right? So this is what a choke point does. And everything that we have understood informationally from that is exactly that. Now, why is it a good thing? It means that you can drastically reduce complexity. And it means also that you essentially can cluster all histories and say, okay, all these histories are essentially the same, right? When I enter my favorite restaurant, I've been there 10,000 times in different 10,000 clothes, different ways and so on. But when I get there, I always can order my steak and chips. It always works the same way. And I do think, actually do notice that many religions and meditation techniques have this thing where, like, forget the past, clean yourself, and there's a very good reason for that, because this is stuff that occupies your brain, so you get rid of this and clean it up for future inputs, right? And this is just made explicit, but we do that implicitly all the time. If you can't do that, people who can't do that, they have a problem. They actually have to undergo some they get clutter. They get basically memory hoarders, if you like, if you get the gist.
Oh, I get the gist already. And I'm wondering if this is part of the, some lived experience there. I'm wondering if, like, is that maybe even part of the reason we have like Sabbaths and vacations?
I'm sure that that's a good reason. Yes, it's exactly. It's a cleanup. Let's flush it through, and let's start afresh. You don't throw away everything, of course, but you really declutter. And I do think that all of this has an analogy, or most of this has an analogy in the informational language. The reason I like information theory is because it's, it doesn't play favorites, right? It gives you results, and you may not like them, but they tell you something usually. And we found that again and again, that sometimes it predicts things with, say, that doesn't make sense. Then we understood, yes, it actually does make sense, and actually that's what happens. Or that is a phenomenon that we can at least match up with things we know from cognitive science. So it's a theory that knows something about how knowledge is being processed, and it knows more than we put into the model, which is usually a sign of a good theory. And that's the reason why I think thinking in terms of information as the language of discourse is a productive way of thinking. It's not just a measure to, a loss or just some kind of distance measure. It's also this, but it's more than that. We treat it as almost the quantity of discourse, the language of discourse. We express it in this language and we understand phenomena in this sense. I'm not saying it's the only way to do that, but it works. And so that's the way we pursue.
So it's this common currency that's letting you do basically advanced modeling and proofs in mathematics and giving you a different type of reliable knowledge. It's like common currency of sense making, even though like there's like in specific use cases, maybe the bits become their agnosticism with respect to their significance, like in the embodied case. Yeah. But still, when you go back into ultimately, you then trade in though, like ultimately though, when you're doing the math, the bits are agnostic about their meaning, or
not always.
Not always.
Not always. I mean, it really depends, and it's actually a good question. Again, a whole separate topic. When bits have to be agreed, they're agnostic. Some bits cannot be agreed. They are imposed by the structure of the environment, and we cannot choose them. I have actually an example for that. But again, this is probably a discussion for another time. But I do think that some bits can be interchanged, others cannot, or there are groups of bits which can be interchanged in their meaning, and whether this is possible or not it depends. And many bits are just completely freely choosable. No, there's no reason that we use actually a QWERTY keyboard. You could have a completely different keyboard, Dvorak, or even a completely separate keyboard on your computer, and you could still type English. Even if we agree on English, the keyboard could look entirely different. In fact, the keyboards that are being used seems to be, I mean, originally there was a legend that it was to slow down the typers, no idea why. Then there was another story.
Jamming. The overly skilled typists who had automatized they're just overly skillful. Their fingers move so quickly they would jam the typing mechanism.
Yeah, that may be it. So that was slowing down, but not for a destructive reason, but just to make the mechanism. Okay, that is really one example for where embodiment imposed constraints on the coding. But if that's not there, then we don't have any limitation.
It's an interesting though, these seeming paradoxes keep coming up where it's like, you think, more degrees of freedom are, always better. Not so. I mean, like it's you think, well, should you want to get what you want. And so to get what you want, you have to know what you want. Sometimes not knowing completely what you want is actually more effective for getting what you want. Sometimes relinquishing power is the best way to be empowered in a way. Seems.
Yes, this is well known. I mean, this is a classic example that sometimes more is less. And empowerment is about actually the local landscape of moving somewhere instead of enforcing something. That's kind of the story.
It reminds me of Taoism, isn't like the opening line of the Tao Te Ching, like the way that can be followed is not the true way. In some ways, I think that's almost like that might be the central teaching. Is this, but I am losing the battle between jet lag and hotel coffee.
That is perfectly understandable. I think we have had a very thorough discussion already.
So I would love to do this again, and so we will continue whenever you're up for it, and going deeper into that particular article, because I want to give that a fair handling, because I think its implications are extremely important, both for artificial intelligence and for psychology and the mind sciences in general. So this is what I think, even though I interrupted you terribly and took us on too many
No, it's good. It's good.
hopefully this will be like a general, like broad survey, so people are like kind of seated with a lot of different ways before like, but yeah, next time I want to definitely give you the lead more and not derail you so much. So
No, this was perfectly fine. Actually,
okay.
it's good to know that, okay, this is what you want to hear about, or this is what you're thinking about. So I feel that this is something that I'm very happy with. Please go, continue doing it.
Okay, wonderful. So I will stop the recording, and looking forward to next time. Thank you. So.
Okay, good.